Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Fierce Awakened Woman Global Online Conference. I'm Jenn Baljko, your host and creator of the summit and founder of Always On My Way. And as you know, this is a call for the brave and gentle-hearted so that we can really dig into our fierce awakened selves and spark our dynamic feminine grace and ground our masculine courage and begin to share what we know with our global village and invent new ways forward. So today we have a really special featured guest, and we'll be in a wonderful conversation with Dr. Jenn Shinoda Bolen. Hi, Jenn.
Hi.
How are you? Let me tell you a little bit about Jenn. Dr. Jenn Shinoda Bolen is a psychiatrist, Jungian analyst, activist, and an internationally known author and speaker. She's a distinguished life fellow of the American Psychiatric Association and a diplomate of the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology, a former clinical professor of psychiatry at the Langley Porter Psychiatric Institute, University of California Medical Center, and a past board member of the Miss Foundation for Women, the International Transpersonal Association, and the C.G. Jung Institute of San Francisco. She is the author of 13 books in over 100 foreign editions, and among her titles are the classic book on feminine psychology and archetypes, Goddesses in Every Woman, Powerful Archetypes in Women's Lives, Like a Tree, How Trees, Women, and Tree People Can Save the Planet, and Close to the Bone. She is an NGO permanent representative to the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women from the Women's World Summit Foundation in Geneva, and also represents Pathways to Peace, the Millionth Circle, Earthchild Institute, Women's Perspective, and the International Public Policy Institute. She is in 3 acclaimed documentaries, the Academy Award-winning anti-nuclear proliferation film, Women for America for the World, the Canadian Film Board's Goddess Remembered, and Femme, Women Healing the World. It is with great honor and humbleness and joy that I welcome Dr. Jenn to the Fierce Awakened Woman Conference.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you very much.
Hi.
And most people call me Jean.
Jenn. We'll start there. And let's just look. We're looking. We got people in Washington. Oh yeah, the Sherry in Maine. The link to the Facebook. It's in the Fierce Awakened Woman group, which I don't have handy at the second, but I'll get that for you. But first, thank you everyone for coming. And Jenn, would you like to open our circle here?
Yes, I would. I would like to. I consider all of us online in a international circle, and that we are linked at the heart chakra and feel a connection with one another. And the sound that connects us is a vibration at the heart chakra level. And I sound my Tibetan bowl, and it rings through the entire circle. Ooh. Feel yourself dropping into your heart. This is a source of deep feeling. It's also the source of courage. Courage comes from the French word coeur, for heart. And it is with courage and heartfulness that we can make choices to be an activist in this world. Not out of prestige, not out of being identifying with a warrior, although we do have to realize that it's called upon us from time to time to step up and into the warrior in us, but the warrior who's motivated at the heart level. So with that, I would like to start us in this circle. And hope I've touched on some piece of heart and courage and inquiry in each person.
You know, I was going to start with putting us on the same page with synchronicity. But intuitively, I think I'd like to go back to something we were just talking about before the call, about fierce, and a different way of how we can think of fierce as sort of a common starting point here in this conversation as we move through this idea of synchronicities and tending to each other and all the different topics we'll touch on today. But can you tell folks what fierce, how fierce shows up for you?
When you invited me to be part of this conference, the part that really impressed me was the amazing fire and flower that is the logo for this online summit, because it was beautiful, but it was powerful in ways that fierce compassion comes out of a sense of what you love and what you care about and what you will rise to the occasion for in a fierce way, because your heart is in it. And so I also was taken by your choice of words, where you put fierce together. And you don't usually think of it as a feminine word until you think about one of the animal symbols of Artemis, the goddess of the hunt and the moon, and the symbol of the Girl Scout, really, who roams over the wilderness with her band of nymphs, or with her women's group, and comes to the defense of the powerless, especially little young girls, and takes care of the young of all living things. So to look after with compassion, think about the mother bear. She is the fiercest mom you could ever have. Don't mess with my cub or you are in trouble. So fierce can actually be part of a strong feminine. We usually try to just make nice a lot of the time, and then think that if we're being strong about something, we're being masculine, when we are often just being who we are. And it's rather wonderful when you're free to be. I mean, I'm remembering the way back when, the beginning of the Ms. Foundation, which I was part of, and the girls' book called "Free to Be You and Me," free to be yourself, free to use your own talents, free to grow into who you could be. So that started me off as an idea back, when it was about girls becoming who they could be. And then the basis of my deeper work, of course, is as a psychiatrist, Jungian analyst, and people choose to go into a Jungian depth analysis process in order to liberate parts of themselves that have been suppressed often. Often it's because you get to midlife and, okay, you've behaved yourself well enough, you've gotten yourself educated, you've done a whole lot of different things, and then you run into the flatness of, but life ceases to have much meaning. And at this particular point, this is when tuning into what has been overlooked deep in your psyche can come to the fore through listening to dreams, for example, or being moved by art or music or a talent that was naturally you, but you were told that it was probably true. Well, you can't make a living doing that, or it's not feminine, or whatever it is. And so here we are in our liminal time, meaning we are all in pandemic time now. And we can't go back to what was, because there's no, and for certain people, especially who've lost people, you can't go back. It won't be like it was, because the people that you loved who died in the pandemic or in a shooting such as just happened in Colorado,
Heartbreaking.
the people that you were used to just being there suddenly aren't here anymore. I think that brings a level of consciousness to each of us, but especially to those who have been directly affected by an unexpected death.
And I think this is a really, I'll say beautiful because that's the word that sort of came to my mind, but I think this is the space that we're all looking to hold right now, is this liminal space, right? And discovering the synchronicities of it, coming into a new sense of fierceness and inventing this way forward. And I know synchronicity is something that you talk about a lot in your work, and also tending for each other, right? This brings up, like that mama bear and the protection quality that women carry within us. And when we now have to deal with, right, in the US, there's more than 500,000 people who died because of coronavirus, millions and millions around the world who have suffered from this. And we're not going back. So, how do we manage this liminal space, this in between and betwixt phase that we're in, and then choose how to empower ourselves to go forward?
A liminal time is an in-between time. It's in between what we were used to being and doing and entering a time where we're not very clear yet. But we are aware that as we become aware in this liminal time, for example, people dream more than ever. If you're going to be working from home, you don't have an alarm set and suddenly the alarm goes off and whatever you were dreaming is totally forgotten as you jump out of bed. Now, almost everybody who's able to work from home or isn't working at all wakes up naturally. And I just would encourage everyone, before you jump out of bed, go over the dream you just had and tell it to yourself what happened, and then get out of bed and maybe write some notes about it. And then you have something deep to think about during the day. Who were in the dream that you haven't even thought about for a very long time? Where did the dream take place? Is this a symbolic person? Can you relate to something in your dream that tells you something about yourself? And these are the ways of uncovering remembrances. For a long time, people are so busy doing what they're supposed to do that they naturally suppress memories that if you get back in touch with, you may grow into who you were meant to be, is what my feeling is that we come into the world not as a blank slate, but with our particular archetypes already in us. Jung calls this the collective unconscious, the archetypes of the collective unconscious. And when I wrote about the gods and goddesses in Greek mythology, it was because they were familiar patterns. And boy, are they different and unique. And do people relate to particular ones of them? And then when you start to know where your natural energies are, and you can, or your talents are, one of the wonderful ways of knowing that you're growing into a part of yourself that is who you are inside is when you do it, you lose track of time. I mean, if you love what you do and something grows from inside out into what it is you're doing, it's like amazing how fast time goes by or how slow time goes by. I mean, ordinary clock time is not relevant anymore when you are being creative about whatever it is that your heart is in. And back again, heart chakra. What is your heart most involved in? Who matters? What matters? What are your values?
I love that you touched on the word.
By the way, I keep dropping the word synchronicity, and you keep reminding me of it. so
Well, but I think even your word remembrance, because I have that very embedded in this conference, is this idea of remembering who we are, rekindling this, reigniting our passions. And what I'm finding is that I'm remembering what I loved to do when I was 5 or 6.
wonderful. That's wonderful.
Right? And it's not just the trauma moments, it's the actual taking time to say, my impulse for freedom right now is dancing in the kitchen, right? Like that's something I would love to do forever. And the idea of remembrance and how that fits now into this idea of either synchronicity or tending to ourselves, right? So that we can take care of others. How do you see this?
Well, I think about remembering and its opposite, which is dismemberment. Dismemberment, you cut off parts of yourself.
Mm-hmm.
In order to fit in to your family or to your school group or whatever, you have to dismember, cut off parts of yourself that is not welcome. And often just to be acceptable, going through the school years, going up through college, for example, there's a sense of having to meet often not just the academic standards of school, but in the schoolyard, the social acceptable parts of yourself. Whatever is socially not acceptable, you dismember, you cut it off and don't express it. But if it hasn't been done, if it's done just to sort of get by, it sits around. Whatever is dismembered is still in the psyche of the person. And so in this period of liminal time, what are you remembering that got dismembered along the way? And as you remember it, you have a sense of being put back to important parts of yourself being reconnected with. I mean, your example of letting your inner kid that dances in the kitchen come out. Why not? You know, this is what we can do in this liminal time. We can be who we are. We can do things that make us feel, if we were doing it in front of certain other people, that we would feel, you know, either stupid or inept or some such thing. But then when you actually express it in some way, and then you, as you did, you remember being 5 and dancing in the kitchen, and you appreciate your 5-year-old. You know, what will you and she do next?
I love the idea that it's almost like RE with a hyphen, remember, as opposed to remember being together. Yeah. I like playing with this concept of the putting yourself back together.
Right.
So we can all move forward.
What is remembered? And the idea of synchronicity, and by the way, synchronicity was, of all my books, it was the first one I wrote. And it came about in part because of meaningful coincidence or synchronicity. Synchronicity at that point was an esoteric word. The book came out in 1979. It was a long time ago. And yet it's timeless because synchronicity is timeless. Timeless synchronicity is meaningful coincidence between something important inside of a person and an outer event that reflects it back. So, for example, if you should have a dream about someone that you haven't even thought about for a very long time, say someone who you remember back in elementary school, and then you see a Facebook something, or you see a connection with that same person on the next morning when you wake up, and you're thinking, wow, that's really a coincidence. And one of the things about synchronicity is you have to go beyond that gee wow sense. Isn't it amazing? I dreamt about this person, and then if we were out on the streets, we would say we could bump into them on the street, but now we're all sheltered in place. But you just put everything, you mentioned going onto Facebook with this conference right now. Well, who knows who's meeting up with each other on Facebook these days? I'm seeing classmates from college years getting together in groups, for example. So there's something about the synchronicity of the inner world and connecting with the outer world. And when that happens, there is a sort of it sort of like underlines the dream. It says, oh, it's important. This person was important for me to remember. Well, then we take remember and we take it one step deeper. What does that person symbolize that maybe you have cut yourself off from? And maybe this is the time for that part of you to have time. Maybe it's to be a dancer, maybe it's to be a writer, maybe it's to be an artist. Maybe it's to take time to do what you kept saying. If I only had time, I would really seriously meditate. If I really had time, I would do, what would it be that you would do? Because if you're sheltering in place right now, maybe you have time to explore a great many things. I know we all can learn a lot just by seeing what's available if we really want to learn it. It's an interesting time to be.
It's an interesting time to be. And how you're here right now is part of that synchronicity, truly, because the inspiration for this exact idea of the summit came from a meditation I had where I had Artemis and Lilith leading and running through the woods with hundreds of women. And we were going back to a village. And I always say that it's Artemis who was giving out the gifts, but it could have been Lilith. But we were all gathered around and they were giving us, all of these women who had arrived to the village, gifts, their unique gift to take back out into the world. And there were 2 meditative journeys that I took to reach that village. But when I was thinking about Artemis as one of the goddesses in this, I could not help but say, oh, I have to send you an invitation because of the work you've done with these archetypes. And I thought, maybe you'll say yes, maybe you won't. And you said yes like last week. I was so like, wow, this is really, me, the most serendipitous synchronicity of part of this conference. So I'm really glad to see that.
Artemis.
Yeah,
That's an archetype we share in common.
Yeah, the girl
who has a sense of sisterhood has a quality of Artemis in her.
Yeah.
Or if she has a sense of being in a beautiful spiritual world when she's out in nature. I think about my own Artemis coming so much alive in me during summers as a Girl Scout up in Girl Scout camp, where we slept out of doors every night. And how on about the 2nd or 3rd summer, it was probably just 9 or 10, when I was sleeping out under the stars. We did every night. I mean, imagine seeing the Milky Way if you were coming from Los Angeles, where the light gets in the way of seeing stars. You don't see stars at night in Los Angeles. You go up to the mountains and wow, there is the Milky Way, and it is gorgeous. It is beautiful. But if you're 8, 9, 10 years old and you're looking at it, is awesome, but you probably don't even know the word awe. But yet there's an innate relationship to beauty in most of us. And so I would go to sleep at night under the stars until the one night when I realized when we went through something of, if you see a shooting star, you can make a wish. So I started to scrutinize the sky, and I saw a shooting star, and my eyes followed it, and something shifted in me. And this is how there are shifts in consciousness. For me, I was just looking up there. And then there was this shift because I was so open to the experience of the beauty of it. And I was spending time looking for shooting stars. And then I had that, I didn't have the words for it until I was much older. But the shift that happened was that I was part of this magnificent universe. It wasn't out there. I was part of it, and I knew it deep inside myself. And it would probably be a decade or more before I had the word that helped me to know what my experience was. But the oneness or the Tao, in fact, I didn't come across the proper word for decades later when I wrote the book on synchronicity and looked for, well, who knows? If you write anything creative and you start to look for references or and things like that, synchronicity happens. You come across, you get help. This is why I've been able to write as many books as I have, because when I've become pregnant with a book. It's the idea. The idea, I'm infused with this and I'm holding it. And in that process, somehow the nutrients come via what I get exposed to. And so I had not heard of the word Tao, T-A-O, the Tao, which is an ancient Chinese idea of the oneness that underlies everything. It was the perfect word for what it was for me under the stars when that shift happened and I was part of this magnificent universe. I participated in the Tao without knowing what the word was. And the more one follows what is heart and soul, the more one gets synchronistic help along the way. I mean, that's been true for so much of my life. And right now, especially just before the liminal thing started, suddenly 7 or 8 of my books I just got an email that said all the books that were Canary, Red Wheel Wiser books now are now being transferred to a company I'd never heard of. It's called Mango, and it was in Florida. Well, I liked it. I love mangoes, but a publishing house called Mango in Florida. And then it unfolded. They are an amazing. I started reading articles about them in Publishers Weekly because they were using online. They were moving differently than the New York publishers, and they were growing into one of the fastest growing publishing houses in the U.S. And the editor. The associate editor, the only one that was out on the West Coast, turned out to be the woman who worked at my first publisher, Harper, when it was Harper, it was Harper Monroe. And she came in right out of graduate school into the as a publisher assistant, sort of editorial assistant. And her name was Brenda Knight. And Brenda was at Harper's when I was at Harper's, and then when I moved to another company called Canary, later she was there, and now, lo and behold, she's associate publisher of Mango, and then, so I am very, very much aware that there's a lot of synchronistic help at getting what I am doing into the world, and so when you sent me an invitation with that amazing fierce flower. Now that's a strange use of words, fierce and flower. You don't usually see them together, but that's what your logo looked like. And so I'm just saying, if I feel moved and can do it, yes, I'll see. So anyway, I'm thankful.
Well, and I want to go back to something you said about looking up at the sky and feeling that you're part of the universe, right? And I think for many of us, or for me personally, I'll speak from my own experience of my experience of hugging trees is probably also directly related to your book, like a tree.
Mm-hmm.
And this protection quality that we have for nature, or when you are a tree person, right? How this shifts your perspective a bit. And that feeling of of Tao and the oneness, right? How we connect to this. How can we do that now as we're remembering ourselves? How do we form that connection so that we can use it as a ground for choice or a ground for possibility or a ground for creation?
One of the things you need to be able to do is to follow your own impulses, even if part of you thinks, now that's silly. For example, hugging trees. You are a grown woman and you are out hugging trees. What is the matter with you?
Oh, I have gotten looks like that and I just don't care.
What's interesting about tree hugger, the word chipko is the name of it was a movement in India that saved trees at the base of the Himalayas because the women in the village formed large circles, held hands, and hugged the trees and protected them. The loggers respected what the women were doing and didn't cut them down. And it led to what's called the Chipko movement in India, which meant tree huggers. So there's something about standing up for what you value and be willing to look ridiculous if that's what it puts you into somebody else's eyes, but not into your own, and not to others who get it. That if she has the courage to do that, then maybe I have the courage to do the equivalent something, to speak up, to stand up, to hug the tree, to stop something that would otherwise keep on being pushed, to stop it.
Yeah.
Today, before, and I'm sure it's probably true for most of the people that are listening, you and I listened to the news this morning, which was about 10 people who were shopping in a supermarket being gunned down. You know, they just went to the store. You know, don't we often do that kind of thing? We just think, oh, forgot this, go to a store. And then it happens to be when a gunman comes and shoots 10 people dead on the spot. Whoa, you know, that, and everybody around Boulder on hearing the news, they didn't hear right away at all who it was that was shot until the next morning. So all during the evening, it's who didn't come home? Are you okay? All of that went on in Boulder. Well, to some extent, so much of this has been going on all over the world due to the pandemic, because with something like 500,000 and more deaths who also died as suddenly often. I mean, they weren't sick particularly, and then they got sick very swiftly, and then they were taken to the hospital, and then they were put on a ventilator, and nobody could see them, and they died. But 27 or 8 million Americans were taken to the hospital and lived. A number of them have side effects and things still, but you came close. It could have been you. I think that there is not anyone who, if you thought about it, if, for example, there was a member of your sibling who had something unfortunate happen to them, and you are aware it could have been you. As soon as you become aware of it could have been you, I would really suggest that it emphasize underneath it that life has a purpose and you still have your life. What are you going to do with it, especially now? What are you going to do with your life now? Don't you realize you can make a difference in small ways, like planting trees, for example? You can gather together. I met Wangari Maathai at the UN who won a major prize for tree planting. She started with, if you have to cook on a fire using firewood, pretty soon everything that is burnable within your village gets cut down. Well, she's seen that. She started bringing to villages the idea of planting seedlings and then nurturing them and then planting them. And pretty soon she had created the Green Belt movement in Kenya. And the Green Belt movement gave her an international prestige, and so she was at the UN. So you start with an idea and you can really make a difference. And her group planted something like 17 million trees. Well, there's an organization called Tree Sisters in Great Britain. Mm-hmm. That's doing exactly that. They're planting trees. And the thing about it is not enough trees, too many people, and we've got global warming, we've got global pollution, and we could change that at a very low level of planting trees, just as we can change things politically by forming women's circles and supporting the activism of each one of us in that circle. Because I grew up in the silent generation and all, when the women's movement began in the 70s, at the late 60s, it appeared to be just angry women initially, and then it was the women's movement began, so that by the end of the 60s, the 70s became the era of the women's movement. And it just was women gathering together. And this is what the whole concept of one of my activisms grew out of a book called The Millionth Circle, How to Change Ourselves and the World. Think large. When you are part of a women's circle, you are one unit, and you're building towards that metaphorical millionth unit, that plus the astrological sign of this era that favors such things. We're contributing to the Aquarian age of egalitarian activism. So be part of the bigger movement during this liminal time. Whatever you do now can make a difference.
I love that. And it makes me vibrate hearing that, right? Like something so simple as planting a tree and standing together in a circle and sharing a story together, right? And who knows, like we said before, who knows what the ripple effect is going to be or what the outcome is going to be. We don't need to concern ourselves with the outcome. We just need to keep taking that next fierce action, right? That one next step to do it.
Right. And I love that you keep using the word fierce, because fierce, the first time I heard it with another word that seemed like, well, that's fascinating, the two together. It was called use of the word fierce compassion. Fierce compassion. When you really care so deeply for people who are suffering, that you act like Mother Bear in looking out for the vulnerable, for goodness sakes. If you're strong enough to look out for the vulnerable, then you're contributing to changing the direction of Homo sapiens. And Homo sapiens sapiens is an interesting title for us, because sapiens means wisdom. And we've not been all that very wise. But if we act from the heart and from compassion, might we grow into being truly Homo sapiens sapiens? I hope so.
Well, if you have a few more minutes, shall we encourage our sisters and brothers who are in the community here to ask a few questions and share their questions with you? Would you like to take a couple questions, Jean? Did I lose you? I hope not. Jean, are you still there? Yeah. Okay. If anybody has a question for Jean, if you want to put it into the chat, or if you want to raise your hand, take a couple questions. We have a few minutes for questions. And I think my hand is up. Oh, okay, I don't know what I just did there, but I know we do have one question from somebody in the Fierce Awakened community, and I'll just pose that as the first question, or the question from the community. And it's from Sheila, who's in North Virginia. And she asked me to ask you, how can we lovingly encourage women across generations in our families to fearlessly dig into deep exploration of themselves?
It begins with what has been going on via Zoom, which is where family units schedule Zoom circles regularly and start to bring up questions and start to share themselves, because so much of American people, as you're an American person in Lisbon, or close to Lisbon, for goodness sake.
Barcelona, but close enough.
There are people, family members, who are closer now during this liminal time, thanks to Zoom, than they have been for decades. They're getting acquainted across generations as well. Where in a circle, the basic circle, and the book, The Mayan Circle, has, and the website on the Mayan Circle has the basic, circle principles. And each person takes their share, or has a share. Everybody's voice is heard in a circle. There isn't one overriding voice, as there often is in a patriarchal family. And most families are often patriarchal. But then you go on to Zoom and you have circles in which even the littlest person in the family gets to speak into the circle. And then the idea of the Mayan Circle, which is different from say, consciousness raising group circles, is that there is a call for silence at the beginning, such as I did with the sound of the bell, and I would like to sound it at the end as well. Is when you're all joined together and you go inside, and you're not hierarchical, and you also can put in, by the end, in yourself, without putting it into words for everybody. In the silence, you ask for support for a dream that you carry, and you have the support of the energy of the field. And so this is what is so readily accessible. So the question again, could you sharpen it? Because I get lost when I go wandering off, as I just did.
They're beautiful wanderings, because they have so many little, I love this word that I learned from Elizabeth Jones, who's an astrologer, but she called them cosmic breadcrumbs, that we just kind of show up. So her question was, about lovingly encouraging cross-generational conversations in families.
Have 3 generations of people meet regularly. And one of the things is also sharing basic information, because so many people don't have much opportunity to get a sense of the family as a unit, or what the genealogy was. And now you can get your genealogy online. You can view a circle online. It's amazing. So take a risk. Whenever you invite anybody to anything, you kind of are risking being turned down, or you're risking being misunderstood. How can you get through life without venturing out? I mean, you got me to be here, and I'm delighted to be here because you decided to invite me. We had nobody in common. You'd read, I guess, Goddesses in Every Woman. So
I have, and like a tree, and well, and probably other, like the idea of synchronicity has been in my space for a long time. I grew up in the 70s, right? I was born in the 70s. So your wisdom and folks like Gloria Steinem, this wisdom was in my consciousness when I was growing up, right? So yeah, it was just, how can I have a vision of Artemis and not think of you, right? In my mind, that was sort of how I probably learned about Artemis at some point in life, but I don't even
Artemis
remember.
actually, you know, that was a source. It wouldn't have been called Goddesses in Every Woman and have all the major Greek goddesses if I hadn't started with Artemis, and then thought, but what about the other goddesses? And it ended up with all of them. And then actually my last book is focused on Artemis, because this is the time. This is the time for the sister archetype. The sister archetype, sister to sisters, but also sisters to brothers. See, the thing about Artemis in her genealogy, which is metaphoric, was that she was the firstborn of twins with Apollo, the god of the sun. And so when you see men as brothers, as not as fathers over you, it's different. And I think this is what's happening.
Yeah, I'm the oldest of five, so I have a very deep sister energy, but I've always had more of the call to sisterhood rather than motherhood, for example, right?
The other thing about Artemis is, unlike Athena, who is very much at home in the cities, Artemis is the goddess of the wilderness.
Mm-hmm.
And so she likes to make her way through uncharted terrain, which we of the women's movement are doing. They haven't laid out a path for us to easily follow. We have to sort of,
Work
strike
forward
on our own and create the road that we're on. And we are doing it.
Yeah. We have a couple questions. One is from Alejandra. What is the difference between fierce and anger? I know rationally that it is not the same, but sometimes it comes out one for the other. Confusion. So yeah, what is the difference between fierce and anger?
Like the subtitle for the book on Artemis is the indomitable spirit in every woman. Indomitable means, it means that you carry a sense of spirit about what you're about that persists because it's part of you. Indomitable. It's not going to be erased without erasing you, practically. Because that you have this sort of, so the fierce from the standpoint of indomitable sometimes looks like stubbornness, by the way. It looks like you're stubbornly persevering in something. Is a fierce assumption that you're going to persevere, and that's fierce. Fierce from the standpoint of enraged is different. It has a sense often of, I am going to get even. There's an energy in it that has some basic impurities in it, because it can take you over and turn you into somebody less than you could be otherwise. When you are fierce from the standpoint of vengeful, for example. But the energies can look very similar on the surface, but what persists has to do with whether your heart is in it and you're basically on a chosen positive path, or whether you're being run by a need for vengeance, which has its own points sometimes, and but it contaminates the carrier of it along the way too, because it's very hard to have. That's why love sort of disappears under all the rage of anger and getting even and things like that. Well, fierce compassion is where you are fiercely caring about protecting something or a principle that comes from the heart. And yes, they will be sometimes confusing. And yes, when people oppose you and step and diminish you for what you are standing for, it's pretty human nature to get angry back. But then you kind of learn along the way that doesn't carry you that far compared to staying with the indomitable spirit of I'm on course. I'm growing into myself when I do what I'm doing.
And we have two similar, well, one's a question and one's a comment, and it's from Lib and Michelle. And Lib asks, well, how do the African and Egyptian goddesses figure into fierceness, imagery, and wisdom? And Michelle says she's reading the Gospel of Mary Magdalene and how female gospels were left out of the Bible. And Alejandra said, thank you for the answer to her question. So, yeah, how do other goddess archetypes figure into where we are now? And
you see, the archetypes we culturally give archetypes names. They're basic patterns. They're patterns that have almost the quality of instinct. You come into the world. One of my parts of training that I loved was delivering babies. And then the babies would be cleaned up and brought into the newborn nursery. And, from newborn nursery on, a basic archetypal pattern emerges. There's a nice placid little one and then there's the active little ones, and then there are the energetic little ones. And then when you see them growing into the first year of life, you see an energy pattern in the babies. Well, it has to do with how they're wired and how they're wired in an archetypal fashion too. I mean, because everyone comes in not as a blank screen, but with certain innate talents, abilities, and these are archetypal patterns. So yes, they have different names in Africa and Egypt. They have different names in Indigenous American ones, but the fundamental sort of sense, for example, of Artemis. She won't be called Artemis in another culture, but as a goddess presence who looks after the young and the vulnerable and the animals and the wilderness, the girls that on being invited to be a girl guide or a girl scout and go out and up the camp, there are girls that just love it, like me, and there are girls that just have nothing to do with it, or they grew up in the city and they just never did have much of an exposure to nature. But as soon as they were exposed to nature, they kind of found themselves in it and loving it and in awe of it. And I'm suggesting that there are variations that have to do with certain qualities that the culture personifies, but the basic underlying pattern is the same cross-culturally, and one of them really is very similar to Artemis.
Yeah. Just into Michelle's comment about the female gospels that have been left out in the how do we reclaim some of that, I guess?
Well, it is getting certain things are being reclaimed, because finally there are women scholars, for one thing. That so much of what is given respect by a culture has to do with who's saying it, and who's saying it has to do with the kind of ability to be educated along the way. And it's only been very, very recently that women have been stepping into the roles. I mean, in the United States and in the world. It was in the 70s that women became much more able to enter whatever field interested them. And they are reconnecting as scholars with past suppressed information. And so it's through women that so much is emerging now that has been submerged, or back to the word dismembered, being remembered, reconnected with, been brought forth. And it's very helpful to look and have an affinity to goddess figures in other countries, in having a sense that part of you resembles that amazing, strange figure, because they all seem kind of strange at first until you feel them out in yourself.
Right. We'll take one more last question, and it's from Lib, and she's asking: women and goddesses are typically associated to the moon, but are there goddesses associated to the sun? And what energy does solar energy provide for women now?
The chief goddess of in Japan is Amaterasu, as the sun goddess. Although the bigger question about whether the if you take sun and moon and you wonder about your own energies, if for example, most people have had some affinity to having astrological readings. So there's and clearly within the astrological signs of the zodiac, if you're born under the sign of Leo, you are clearly, a sun baby. And if you're born under a sign of the moon, then you're definitely a moon child. In fact, my son, I'm a Cancer. And what's interesting is Cancerian is such a bad word that if you just skim newspapers, the sign of Cancer is called Moonchild. and I think one is more extroverted, the other one is more introverted, because if the moon sees by reflected light, for example, and takes things in, or at least from a standpoint of a Cancerian person, it is the capacity to reflect on things, to go inward, which is where I do so much of my writing and dreaming from. But my sun sign, which is how I'm meeting you in an extroverted way, happens to be Leo. So I have Leo rising and my sun sign in Cancer. And so I can appreciate both the sun and the moon as being metaphoric aspects. I mean, I just find the language of god, goddesses, and astrology and all of that as to helping a person to have the metaphors that help explain themselves, but taking it one further. The thing about going into depth about one's psyche, which I do as a Jungian analyst, is to realize that we all have a shadow side, undeveloped parts of ourselves that act autonomously in not a good way, behind our back, so to speak. The more we learn about what is active in us, and the better we are at being a person that goes out into the world as a whole person and not projects shadow onto other people, owns our own shadow. It's a little complicated, but complicated in a very interesting way. And we're privileged to be human beings at this time. We are in a terrible time in terms of pandemic, but in terms of the potential for the humanity to save this beautiful planet within the next 30 to 50 years, or watch it all go down. We who are still around now will have some influence and be part of something bigger than ourselves. And whenever you feel that you're part of something bigger than yourself, but you're contributing to making the whole of your personal world or the bigger world better, for you being honest with yourself and clear inside yourself, the more you contribute to and are part of. And it's a privilege. It's just a privilege to be here now. If you want to have an effect in some way on shifting, or maybe just grains of sand, but when the balance is where it is, to be a grain of sand may tilt it.
That's beautiful. Do you have any? I think that's it. Michelle just added to that she is digging into her shadow side because that's where she's finding many gifts.
True enough. It's whatever was not supported often in the family or in the culture, and often certain women's talents are not. Oh, yeah. The girl shouldn't do that. Well, but what about you? What about you? And what about your gifts?
Yeah, we have this just a couple comments to close us out with is this has been amazing. So much more to read, learn, and share in wisdom circles. This is from SLC. I think that might be Sheila, but goddesses in every woman who were so pivotal in my coming of age in my 20s. Ongoing fierce love all around. And Michelle, thank you for the conversation. Yeah. Well, I think for those of us in that 70s, 80s, 90s era, like
when I got to be old enough to write goddesses and older women, I did. And that meant growing beyond the Greek goddesses, because there are certain goddesses in older women, the goddesses of wisdom, the goddesses of wrath, the goddesses that are present in other cultures, but not in the patriarchal Greek ones. So that when I was old enough to write goddesses and older women, I did.
And I have it in my queue. I'm like, okay, am I the old enough woman yet to read that? I think I am, but
because it's 50 the year. It's for archetypes and women over 50.
I have like 7 more months then.
Right.
Any closing thoughts, Jean? And then I know you'll close us out with your wonderful heart chakra sound.
It just back to. I'm really glad that you followed your own sense of why not ask me to speak. You did it came right as it came to me at the very last minute because of my own schedule and whatever. I'm thinking that there's something to be really said for trusting again that place in the heart that where the word courage comes from, where you get inspired and moved to do something, and then you have to have the courage to step up. And the worst that can happen is no. So you serve as a model. And it wasn't just the asking, it had to do with what you had done in preparation, and the metaphor underlying the invitation, which was that fierce flower of all things. That symbol is what we've been talking about in one way or another through most of this session. It has to do with the combination of two words that do not seem compatible, and yet when you see your flower, it's both fierce and it's a flower, and you realize that a strong feminine can be beautiful. Really, it can be beautiful. As a fierce flower, your fierce flower that you found as a symbol for this summit it's beautiful. So I'm going to sound the bell. And what I want each person who's listening to do is to feel it in the center of your chest, in your heart chakra, and let an idea or a word or something important to arise in you that you can feel or pick up from inside out.
Thank you. Really, with so much joy and so much gratitude. Thank you for everything you've contributed to the world and for all of us. And follow your cosmic breadcrumbs. Thank you.